Welcome. My name is Kathy Newcomer, and I'm delighted to greet you, welcome you on behalf of the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration for this first in a series of policy forums focusing on important policy issues that we all are facing as a nation. Tonight, our focus is on inequality and how to address this issue. We will also be meeting again on April 10th at 5:30 for another discussion that will be regarding the coming big disruption, the impact of the digital revolution on middle-class jobs. That'll be on April 10th. But tonight, our school, the Trachtenberg School, is absolutely delighted to partner with Amitai Etzioni and the Institute for Communitarian Policy Studies, also at the George Washington University. We have joined together to put together these policy forums on very important issues. We are delighted to be doing this with Amitai Etzioni, who's a university professor, actually was the first university professor at the George Washington University. So tonight, we're also delighted to have Jared Bernstein, who joined the Center for Budget and Policy Priority in May 2011 as a policy fellow. Between 2009 and 2011, he was the chief economist and economic advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, executive director of the White House Task Force on the Middle Class, and a member of President Obama's economic team. His areas of expertise include federal and state economic and fiscal policies, income inequality and mobility, trends in unemployment and earnings, all topics that are absolutely important to the students in our school and things they think about all the time, maybe even in their sleep. Amitai is one of the most well-known sociologists I know, at least in the U.S. and probably the world. He has taught before at Columbia and Harvard. He served as a senior advisor to President Jimmy Carter, and he founded the Communitarian Network. And I'd like to read this because just in case you don't know about it, it is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to shoring up the moral, social, and political foundations of society. And he writes and addresses a variety of extremely important topics to us all. So I am delighted to have both Amitai and Jared here with us this evening. They are going to talk, and then we are going to take questions from the audience. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for a very generous introduction. I didn't prepare a similar essay about you, Kathy, but I think you all know that she really made the School of Public Policy of GW happen. And we are at the center of the city. And for us not to have a vibrant, vigorous School of Public Policy would be really a very important deficit. And thank you and Joe Cortes for making this happen. I appreciate you taking the time to join us. And
My pleasure.
the communitarian argued that societies, oddly, almost like communities, have moral conversations in which once in a while a topic gets hot. They may be there all the time, but they suddenly become hot. So, for instance, marriage among people of the same gender has been intensified over the last year and such. And until Ukraine pushed it off the headlines, social inequality was one of those issues which for a while the headlines, the public, and the president, and even some Republicans paid special attention to. So my first question is to you is fairly elementary. What is this all about? How serious a problem is it? And what drives it?
Before I answer that, let me just express my gratitude for the invitation. I'm kind of jealous of the students in the room to get to go to this policy school because ever since I've been in DC, I've been invited to interesting events here. I hope this is one of them. But you really do take advantage of the city in a way that, somewhat curiously, other universities around here don't nearly do as much of. So great kudos to the school and the folks here representing it. And Professor Etzioni, I don't want to make you feel old, but I've been learning from your work for a long time, so let's just leave it at that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good idea.
And I'm honored to be on the stage with you. So what's it all about? What drives it? The reason why what Professor Etzioni said is true about this issue of economic inequality being so front and center these days is in no small part because we had the President of the United States, of all people, saying that this was going to be the central issue of his second term, something to that effect in a speech he gave recently. And I've been working on this issue for decades, and I can't say I'm wholly surprised to hear that because I think it is so germane to what's going on in the nation and the economy in ways I'll get into and we'll talk about. But it was striking to hear the president elevate it as such. In no small part because you may recall during the campaign, here we are in Washington, and in 5 minutes we're already talking about politics. During the campaign, the issue of income inequality came up, and Mitt Romney said something to the effect of, this is an issue that should be discussed in quiet rooms. I may not be quoting exactly, but that was the gist of it. Whereas President Obama and Vice President Biden campaigned not only on inequality in their second successful campaign, but very much in their first as well. They may not have always used the word, but they talked about its impact. And here is why, in my view, it's such a big deal. There are many pictures I could show you. Maybe you've seen them if you've seen my work or the work of others who are working on this that capture what's going on here. But I think the first thing that came to my mind when Professor Etzioni said, why is it such a big deal, is a picture that shows the disconnect between productivity growth and compensation, the compensation of the typical worker. Now, there's no reason why productivity and median compensation should grow in lockstep, but in fact they did. For most of the first few decades after the Second World War, productivity and income grew in lockstep, and not the income of the top 1%, but the income of the median household, the one right in the middle of the scale. And then, starting in the late 1970s, productivity kept trucking along at around 2.5% per year, probably closer to 3% then, but it slowed down shortly thereafter. And you started to see median pay, median income flatline in real terms. You saw the income of those at the bottom of the pay scale fall in real terms. So you had something very different happening to American households that was profoundly affecting their living standards. That is, we're now talking about 30 years ago, late 1970s, 34 or 5 years ago. That's 3 decades of income and wage stagnation. Not every year, and there are certainly periods, some very important periods actually, where those trends went the other way. But the divergence, the disconnect between economic growth and the living standards, or the well-being, the economic well-being of really the majority of households, is a very big deal in a country where a social contract, something you're very familiar with, implicitly, in some cases explicitly states, certainly this was the theme of the campaigns, if you work hard, you ought to get ahead. So if you're contributing to the growth of the economic pie, there's no reason your slice should be getting smaller. In fact, it should be, and it was for years, getting larger. That's why it's such a big deal. Its impact on living standards, on the social contract, on the implicit and often explicit arrangement between the families, the households, and what we think of as fair and just distribution of the growth that we have. Now, I can say the drivers, but maybe a pause there and let you catch your breath.
Well, and also, my job is to hold your feet to the fire, at least very gentle fire. Right?
No, go ahead.
So I don't see it.
I do a lot of cable television, so I'm used to the
in
fire.
that case, there's got to be a. I don't see the link yet, because we didn't show that it's these hardworking people who created the increase in productivity. Maybe it's due to Silicon Valley, so that's one question. Maybe the improvement in technology did all that. And second, so you're talking about it, then I understand, as a social justice issue and not as damaging to economic growth, I ask.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So first of all, the answer to my first question was really, why is it such a big deal? Why would the President of the United States elevate this to the level that he did? Why would he run 2 campaigns on it? And I'm telling you that the answer to that is what I said before. It's profound impact on living standards and how different that impact was in the decades following World War II. Now you're getting into questions about the drivers, which is technology, globalization. That you mentioned Silicon Valley, so I think technology. But you're also asking questions about its other more nuanced impacts. So, for example, it's lately there's been a considerable amount of interest. I wrote a paper about this for the Center for American Progress, which I commend to you, on this issue of inequality and growth. To what extent are high levels of inequality slowing down macroeconomic growth? Another very key issue. To what extent are high levels of income inequality leading to lower levels of economic mobility? So that's another impact question. That is, you can have very high levels of income or wealth or wage disparity, such that the distance between the bottom and the middle and the top really spread out. So very large increases in economic dispersion of these variables. But that doesn't tell you anything about how quickly people are moving over the course of their lifetime from one part of the income scale to another. That's mobility. And there is a recent strain of work, very interesting and important, that asks, is it the case that high levels of economic inequality are diminishing mobility? And that's, again, very important in terms of social justice, because in America we tend to believe that we don't necessarily, we don't think about equal outcomes. We're not 5-year planners and think everyone should be the same at the end of the day. But we very much believe in equal opportunity, even though certainly our history has belied that belief, but it is a core belief. So if, in fact, the level of inequality is leading to lower levels of mobility, that's another impact problem. So I consider those impact issues, and we can get into them. Both of them are, I've thought and worked on both of them. But the question of the drivers is highly germane as well. What's different? What changed such that the great divergence between incomes and productivity, between the wealth of the top few percent and everybody else, the 99 versus the 1, if you want to think in terms of Occupy Wall Street. So what changed? So the traditional drivers of inequality that most economists will cite are twofold: globalization and technology. I think the former actually plays a pretty important role. I'm more skeptical about the latter. In the period where incomes and economic growth were quite tight, and productivity were quite tightly matched, the trade deficit on net was balanced. The average trade deficit as a share of GDP was less than 0.5%, about 0. Now that doesn't mean we always had trade surpluses or trade deficits. It just means that they balanced each other out, and that's what you'd like to see in an advanced economy like ours. What's very problematic is not trade. The people who, the protectionists who say we shouldn't engage in trade, I think are wrong. I think trade is an important and essential part of advanced economies. By the way, not just for us, but to help let the Bangladeshis have a chance at higher living standards too. The problem is that ever since this split started occurring, we've had large and persistent trade deficits. So that's an important driver, and it's not one that gets mentioned very often. Technology, so globalization has played a role largely through persistent trade deficits. And basically, to just put a not too fine a point on it, when we have large and persistent trade deficits, we're exporting labor demand. That's led to another big factor in this divergence, and that is the absence of full employment. In the period where incomes and productivity and growth were all growing together, the economy was at the job market, the labor market was at full employment 70% of the time. That means full employment means a very tight match between labor supply and labor demand. I'm doing curves here with my hands. Labor supply and labor demand tightly matched at full employment. When employment gets full enough, employers have to bid up the wage offer to get and keep the workers they need. 70% of the time, the job market was at full employment. In the latter period, with the Great Divergence, 30% of the time the economy was at full employment. So that's another factor. Let me say a word about technology, and then I'll pause. There's no question that technology leads to advantages in our economy of some workers over other workers. This is something labor economists call skill-biased technological change. That is, the economy changes in such a way, it evolves technologically, such that employers demand a certain level of skills from their workers, a certain skill set that's complementary to the technological demands that are entering the workplace. And these days, you might think of computers. An employer, a worker who's skilled in computerization and IT technology and communication technology has an edge over one who doesn't. But the reason I think this idea of technology as a large factor influencing inequality is not as big a deal as people say is because it's such an ongoing secular trend. Right now, we're all focused on computerization. But if you go back to the beginning of economic history, which for me is, maybe 2 or 3 centuries ago, that's about as far back as I can take the data, you see this happening time and again, starting with machine tools and moving on to railroads, and then electricity, and then transistors, and then hi-fi technology, and then lasers, and then the internet, and GPS. It's a long-term secular trend, and what you don't see, obviously, is an acceleration in technology that would lead you to believe it's a key factor. So it's in there, it's in the mix, but it's not as big a deal as some of these other factors. I think the absence of full employment, globalization, and by the way, I think the decline in labor standards, low minimum wages, the absence of unions, overtime violations, a lot of these kind of small core things that they seem small, but they actually amount to something if you sum them all up. The erosion of labor standards. Those are some key things. There's more, but I'll stop there.
Well, beginning to get the picture. It's obviously fairly complicated. But is there anything we can learn about the fact that at least some people claim that they see the same trends in other societies, that China and so on and so on. So it couldn't be that American. And second, and that makes it even more complicated, at least for me, that in the process, wealth was transferred from us to countries with lower standard and lower income. So maybe as there was increasing injustice within each country globally, justice has increased, I'm asking.
Yeah, I think there's some evidence that globally inequality has actually come down, right? Because you've had large emerging economies, developing economies, that have had more of a growth of their middle class. So there's a kind of difference between within group and between group. It is true that in all of the advanced economies and even some of the emerging economies, you mentioned China, there has been similar trends to the ones I've been discussing so far, but, and I think it's an important difference, the US is uniquely outlier, is a unique outlier on many of these metrics. Among advanced economies, our levels of inequality are the highest. Our growth is the highest. The concentration of income among our top 1% or our top tenth of our top 1% is twice that of the next most unequal country. The share of growth that has gone to the top group is, and thus the rest that's gone to everybody else is largest here relative to other countries. Let me say that again because it's a little garbled. If you look at the share of economic growth that's gone to the top of the scale versus everyone else, far more growth has accrued to the very top here in the US than in other countries that have seen their inequality measures grow not nearly as large as ours. The decline in the share of national, there's been a trend towards less compensation and more wealth in national income. Think of national income, or just GDP, as divided between compensation and profitability, just roughly speaking. The labor share has gone down everywhere, but far more here. The wealth share has gone up everywhere, but far more here than in other countries. So whatever this inequality bug is that's biting lots of countries, it's biting us more. And I think a lot of that has to do with the factors I was talking about earlier. A country like Germany is a good example. Advanced economy, many of the same technological trends we've had. They haven't run trade deficits for 30 years. In fact, they've run trade surpluses, which is a different kind of imbalance and problematic in its own right. But they've experienced the same technological trends as we have, and they're neither have they experienced the wage stagnation nor the increase in inequality that we have. We've bit off financialization far more than other countries. That's another factor. We've devoted much more of our economic resources to finance and less to, say, manufacturing than some of these other countries. I think these are factors as well.
Well, I got the point that this thing is appearing in many societies, but we are worse at it than others. But I didn't quite get your answer yet to the justice issue. If as a result there's a major transfer of wealth from the rich to the poor nations, isn't that making up?
Yeah, so when I was talking about, I think in a way, perhaps justice or social justice is too highfalutin or broad a word for me to have used. It's one thing to observe the evolution of poor countries becoming more wealthy, as they should. Even there, by the way, I think there's some problems in the model. It doesn't make sense, in my view, in terms of global economics and global trade, for China to essentially export capital to the US. China is capital poor, we're capital rich. I think that is very much an imbalance in the sense of global inequality that's problematic. But it is true that as some poor countries become more wealthy, as they should, that's clearly a positive thing. What I was talking about was very much within the US, or for that matter, within any other advanced economy, Canada, the UK. After the US, the UK has quite high levels of it. Within these countries, I think there has been the distribution within these countries, the US, the UK, within these countries, the distribution of productivity growth, of economic growth, of wealth, of opportunity, away from those in the bottom half towards those in the top. You can call it unjust, you can call it a violation of a basic social contract. It's the answer to your very first question, which is what's the problem? Why is this a big deal? The reason it's a big deal is because middle-class families have been experiencing stagnant incomes for 30 years. Now, you could go to them and say, wait, you don't realize there are people in China and Bangladesh who are doing better now. And they would say, thanks, but no thanks. I mean, that's not the problem. What bothers them, and I think justifiably, is not that somebody somewhere else is doing better, a little bit better, and that's great. What bothers them is that they're contributing to productivity, to the economy's growth, yet their incomes are flat, and yet the folks at the top are doing much better, have recovered much more quickly than everyone else. And I think their anger is justified. Since this expansion got underway, you may not realize this, but in fact, if you look at the poll results, a lot of people don't realize this. The economy, the US economy, has been expanding since mid-2009. Corporate profitability is up 50% in real terms. The S&P 500 is up 80% in real terms. Now, corporate profitability has more than recovered from the hit it took in the Great Recession. The median household income is down 5%. Now go to the median household and say Bangladeshis are doing better, and see how far that gets you.
Well, I'll leave it for another day to discuss the difference between what is politically acceptable and what's justice, but I'll leave it for another day. But I wanted to go back to the question before we go to cures. Are we talking about wealth inequality? Are we talking about income inequality? Or as some of my colleagues are talking about social and political inequality? And the particular issues which arise when they begin to overlap, because the whole idea was that they are not going to be connected, that you still have one person, one vote, and some of us feel that after Citizens United, you have $1, one vote.
Yeah.
And so is the problem even bigger than we have seen so far?
Yes, and I think that there are quite scary connections, tendrils, between wealth inequality and political representation. And this is not just my view. There's now a couple of scholarly works on this. Martin Gilliland has a good book. Larry, I'm blocking on his name, but the guy at Vanderbilt, political scientist at Vanderbilt, has a good book on this. My concern, I'll get to you. There's very much. There are very interesting and important connections between, and I'll say them from lowest to highest in terms of concentration: wealth, income. Wage, income, wealth inequality. That is, wage inequality. There's a lot of it. Income inequality. There's more of it. Wealth inequality. Wealth is even more concentrated. There's a very important new book by Thomas Piketty, a French economist. It's called Capital in the 21st Century. And he is positing a problem that I've been observing as well that suggests when wealth inequality, and part of this is fairly mathematical, and I don't mean complicated, I mean that it's almost a mathematical identity, that when wealth inequality becomes excessively concentrated, and the return on investment from that wealth, because remember, if you've got a bunch of assets and the market goes up a couple of %, that's a lot of dollars for you just based on your base of assets and on compounding versus someone who's living off $50,000 a year. It's about the median income. Once that return on investment starts beating the economy's growth rate, which is what we've seen lately, wealth concentration just exacerbates. And that's bad enough. But what has me more and more worried is where the professor's question kind of led, which is the specter of wealth concentration buying the policy set that it wants and that protects it, and blocking the policy set that threatens it. And again, I've written about this pretty extensively, and I've posited a model wherein there's a vicious cycle here. And the model predicts things like Keynesian stimulus would get a very bad rap because Keynesian stimulus threatens this kind of dynamic. The Federal Reserve, when it engages in monetary stimulus, would get a very bad rap. The political powers would push for trickle-down tax cuts. That's precisely the type of policy you'd see if wealth was buying the policy set that it wanted. You'd begin to see voter rights being blocked. You'd begin to see an agenda that seemed particularly favorable towards preserving wealth and particularly unfavorable towards ideas like a higher minimum wage. And I think we see all of that in our politics today.
I find it very compelling. It's very much squares with some of the stuff we did. We followed the Chicago school by talking about capture as one of those things. So let's move. So what are we going to do about all this?
Right.
Why do you sigh?
It's hard to, the answer to my last question is that wealth is strangling the politics. And so the question of what you're going to do about it really takes you very much from, I think, the diagnoses that we've talked about for the last half hour to the prescription. I would say that campaign finance is a very big deal here. I won't get into it. I'm not an expert. But I would say, it seems very clear to me that that is a root cause of the gridlocked, pretty horrific politics that's gripping the city now and the nation for such a long time. And remember, the society that can neither diagnose nor prescribe, diagnose what's wrong nor prescribe solutions strikes me as a society that's in a lot of trouble. So answering this question of what you can do about it is a big deal. So I would elevate reform of the political system very highly. So, but put that aside, and just let's all relax and take a breath. It's a beautiful afternoon here, and do a thought experiment of what if we had functional politics? Yeah, I know, it's a chuckle. Imagine that we had functional politics. What would we do about this? I mentioned the absence of full employment as a key factor. Right now we have elevated unemployment rates. The official rate is 6.7%, but that's actually biased down for a number of reasons. There's a weak job market out there, and there are lots of good ideas that would help. One of the problems we have is a lot of people are long-term unemployed. I think we need a program, a government program, that subsidizes their employment. It would be I would scale up something we tried during the Recovery Act, which is when I was working for the Obama administration, a subsidized job program that was quite successful in employing 250,000 people, not a huge number, across the country, with a very large bang for the buck in terms of its return on investment. So I would say subsidized employment, particularly targeted at the long-term unemployed. I would work to bring down the trade deficit, and there are good ideas to do that, which have to do with actually being more of a free trader than some of the folks with whom we compete who manage the exchange rate such that they have a favorable advantage. So I would argue for free trade as a solution here, such that exchange rates are set in markets as opposed to set by currency management. I would argue for better fiscal policy. The budget deficit as a share of GDP fell from 10% of GDP in 2009 to 3% in 2013. These are calendar years, not fiscal years, if I have any CBO freaks in the room. And this is the largest decline since 1950. That's before I was born. So this is a very austere policy. There's absolutely nothing wrong and everything right with a budget deficit coming down when you're moving towards full employment. By the way, I'm testifying tomorrow on the House Financial Services Committee on this very point, so check it out if you're interested. My testimony will be posted tomorrow. It's on this very point. We went austere way too quickly, and that has made it much harder for us to recover. So better fiscal policy that's more responsive to the underlying economic needs, lower the trade deficit, subsidize employment. That's my first tranche of ideas, but I've got a lot more.
We will stay with this presumption that somehow we at least got some kind of a handle on the political situation, so we can have what you call a functional government and not one dominated by the deepest pockets. So about jobs and the job creation or subsidizing such, some people argue that the last two recoveries were relatively job anemic and poor, and so is the current one, and there might be something deeper here at work. And if in that situation you subsidize, train some people, at most what you're going to achieve is they're going to replace some other people who are going to end up out there. So tell me about that.
Okay, so what Professor Etzioni is talking about is a displacement effect, very important when you're talking about a subsidized jobs program. It doesn't help you all. It doesn't help you at all if you hire person B and you lay off person A. That's not a new job. That's just, now you're just subsidizing the employer, right? Because the employer is getting a cheaper worker than she would have otherwise. So there have to be rules against displacement, and those rules have to be enforced. And in fact, the evidence that I've seen is that, for the most part, they were enforced during this program that we tried during the Great Recession. I think that the problem that you mentioned, the fact that the last few recoveries have been jobless recoveries, is not a big mystery that has to do with an acceleration, for example, of labor-saving technology. There's this idea out there, you alluded to it before when you mentioned Silicon Valley. There's an idea out there that we're not going to have as many jobs as we did in the past. We're facing more jobless recoveries. It's going to be tougher for us to get there because technology is replacing labor at a quicker rate than it has before. Now remember, that's been an argument for 200 years. You know, the Luddites have always been wrong eventually. Maybe they're right this time, but I don't think so. What I've seen in every one of these recoveries is just simply very weak demand. Very weak demand, slow economic growth. If you look at the recoveries where employment has come back quickly, the economy has tanked, and contracted. And then it started growing at rates of 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9%. I'm not making those numbers up. That's kind of your grandfather's recession recovery, a V. You know, our recoveries now are L's, sort of backward-leaning L's. You know, they go down and they sort of trickle back up, trickle up. And this is a real problem. I hear economists all the time. Like I said, I debate these folks on cable TV. Say, you know, the economy's growing at trend. This is a good thing. It's true, the economy's growing at trend. This is a bad thing. You have to earn your trend. You have to replace your lost output. You have to get your unemployment rate back down to its full employment rate before you're ready to go back to trend. You have to reabsorb the underutilization of your capital, of your labor. And so we have had weak demand recoveries for years, these last couple of cases, and in large part because of really lousy policy. So prove it, I'll prove it. Now, as most macroeconomists, I have an N of 1, which ain't good, but that's what macro is, unfortunately. And that's, look at the 1990s. The 1990s started as a weak recovery, a jobless recovery, a wageless recovery. Once we got jobs, we didn't have wages. And yet, by the end of that recovery, we were clearly at full employment. The unemployment rate dipped below 4%. The 20th percentile wage, the real wage of low-income workers, was growing at the rate of productivity for 3 or 4 years there, for a real New York minute. The median household was growing at the rate of productivity. Poverty fell more quickly than it had any time on record, and even for the most disadvantaged workers. The employment rates of the most disadvantaged workers, employment rates, went through the roof. We employed tons of single moms coming off of welfare. We achieved full employment. Why? In no small part because a guy named Alan Greenspan, who gets a lot of flack for a lot of good reasons, realized that, in fact, the unemployment rate could go much lower than they thought it could at the Fed without triggering spiraling inflation because of the acceleration in productivity growth. And the Fed let it happen. The Fed stepped back and let us have an accelerated recovery. Now, there was a bubble in there, and that was problematic, and we can get into that. But we achieved full employment with all the results that I would have predicted, that my models would have predicted. So we can do it.
I can't completely not use this opportunity to tell you that together with the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy, we're going to revisit at one point on April 10 and have a whole session just on that one point. Is the new digital revolution causing a different level of kind of loss of jobs or not? And the example the economist gave, when Kodak closed recently, they fired 45,000 people. When Instagram opened, they served 30 million people with 15 persons.
Yeah.
So some people see this.
No, it's a perfectly intuitive thought. When you said Instagram, I have a bad feeling because my 14-year-old daughter is constantly on Instagram, but that's a different problem.
When you say intuitive, you really mean not scientific.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, exactly. I mean, no, that's a very, there are, there's a couple of guys, and they're friends of mine, Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee, have written a couple of books on this issue. And the question really, the way an economist puts it, it's a little technical, but I think it's a good way to put it, has the pace at which technology replaces jobs accelerated? Has labor-saving technology accelerated? That's the question, okay? And they've argued that it has. And Andrew and Eric are friends of mine, and they're the smartest guys in the room who are looking at this. I'm very happy to have them looking at this, and they may well be right. But they themselves will tell you that this is all at the level of anecdote. It is all at the level of anecdote. And what I believe about this pretty deeply is that you can't possibly know whether these anecdotes amount to anything when we're operating with so much slack in our economy. Absent full employment, you just can't know the extent to which these matters are playing out the way Andrew and Eric say they are. They may be right, but with terrible fiscal policy, pretty good monetary policy, but with terrible fiscal policy, with the essential ignoring of the worst long-term unemployment problem we've ever had. The Congress, in its wisdom, just decided to allow unemployment insurance benefits to expire when when long-term unemployment was close to historical highs. Now it is coming down, but it's still way above where it's been in the past when we've allowed unemployment benefits for long-termers to expire. So it's impossible with such terrible economic policy to blame the lack of job creation on technology when your first and most obvious, it's Occam's razor, your first and most obvious factor here is weak demand. Now when we get back to a more normal business cycle, then I think we can evaluate whether those guys are right or not.
There are a lot of people in the room who want to ask you questions, but before that, just one more. So you said there are more things up your sleeve, what you would do. So maybe just give us a short list of those.
Sure. There's something called work sharing, which I think is a really interesting idea. This is where instead of laying people off when you hit a rough patch, you reduce everybody's hours. So it's if you have 100 people in your firm and demand falls by 20%, typically you'd lay 20 people off and they'd all get unemployment insurance. Under work sharing, everybody gets their hours cut a fifth, and unemployment insurance benefits make up part of the difference in wages. So it keeps people on the job, keeps the unemployment rate from going up, preserves workers and their skills. It does spread the pain around more broadly, and that's, nothing's perfect. So I want to be clear about that, but it does. But Germany used that to great effect. Now here's the kicker with that one. Happens to be the law of the land. Believe it or not, we have such a plan in the United States, but it is terribly underutilized. I would pay more attention to these labor standards and these issues of job quality. Increasing the minimum wage seems to me to be a very important policy. The evidence around it suggests that moderate increases don't have anything like the job loss effects that critics worry about. Let me see, what am I leaving off? I mentioned subsidized employment, going after the trade deficit. Yeah, I think that I think I've ticked through most of my list. If I can think of anything I've left off, I'll come back to it. Oh, one other thing, and this is some work of some local economists that have done a lot of this, Harry Holzer and Bob Lehrman. Apprenticeships and on-the-job training. These are very good ideas to help offset high levels of youth unemployment, and they've got a paper coming out from a project I'm working on soon that I commend to you. So I like that idea as well.
Well, thank you. Very thorough and comprehensive review. I'll ask you later if President Biden will do all this, but now it's your turn. If somebody can turn down the lights, I'll be able to see who is at the microphone and call on you. Is that possible? A little more? Okay. If you'll be so kind and come to the mic to ask your questions, then we all be able to hear the question.
And maybe I've answered all your questions.
One of the issues that is facing the United States is our infrastructure across the United States is in terrible shape. How would you propose that we get over this issue of political gridlock to address this need?
Great question, and by the way, that absolutely should have been on my list. I mean, when I say better fiscal policy, in my mind, I'm saying precisely that, which is to, at a time when unemployment is high and labor demand is weak and the private sector has yet to fully climb back off the mat, particularly when borrowing rates, interest rates are so low, and you have such deep infrastructure needs, it's exactly the time to do what the questioner is suggesting. By the way, the arithmetic around this is very interesting and very compelling. I'm referring to a paper by Larry Summers and Brad DeLong for Brookings, but they've done a new paper with Larry Ball for a project that I'm organizing where they carry it a step further. And what they show is that when the rates of interest are very low, the return on your investment doesn't have to be all that high for your investments to largely pay for themselves. Because remember, if we let our public infrastructure erode to the extent that we have, it hurts us in terms of economic growth. And in fact, these extended periods of output gaps and high long-term unemployment and elevated unemployment have now slowed down the growth rate of the economy, what's called the potential GDP. The growth rate of the economy at full employment is actually slower now, considerably slower, because of this negligence. Now, that's all warm-up to your question, which is how can we get our politicians to do something about it? And that gets me back to the points I made earlier about campaign finance. I'll just answer by way of anecdote. I've been in this business a long time. I've worked both in the government and out of it. And when it came to infrastructure, and in fact investment in public goods, I'll say it more broadly, investment in public goods, which means both public capital, roads, bridges, waterways, communication systems, airports, et cetera, water systems, but human capital, education, early childhood learning. I had allies all over the place. I had Republican allies that were deep. The transportation bill was not a partisan issue. These were bipartisan issues. If we were talking about unions and the minimum wage, then I would be fighting all day with these folks. But on infrastructure, everyone realized. So I remember being at the Aspen Ideas Festival, which is one of the few places I rub elbows with industrialists and all that, during the rise of the Tea Party. And this was when they were first threatening to default on the national debt. And captains of industry, I worked for the administration at the time, captains of industry were coming up to me and saying, what can we do about these Republicans? And I was like, well, you asking me? I mean, you're the ones that you ought to be able to call them up. I think the problem is a political one. You cannot send people to Washington who are going there to stop the place, who are going there with the stated intention of blocking the very kinds of things we're talking about, cutting spending, blocking investment, stopping everything, and then act surprised when they stop everything. So it's a political problem. I'm an economist. I could hold forth on political science, but it wouldn't do you much good. I have identified campaign finance as key to this. I guess I would suggest that all of us, and here I'm talking to the academic community, to you, to the director of the program, I would say that we need to do a much, much better job of educating people of the role of government in their lives. Now, if the library, and it has to be down to the level of their lives. I mean, if the library is closed and you can't get there, if Head Start isn't there for your kid, if the road to school screws up your underbelly of your car, if you've got a boatload more snow days because you've screwed up the climate, these are issues that imply a significant role for government, and getting government out of the way is not going to help. So we have to do a lot more in terms of education and campaign finance. And I don't mean education, I'm not saying K through 12 and college. I'm talking about the electorate.
That's a full-time job. I just want to ask you one more thing on the list. How about tax reform? Not only, at least the economists argue that if you had a lower rate and fewer deductions, another dream ticket, that would help. But I'm particularly interested in the question that we tax capital differently than labor, and does that not discriminate against labor?
You know, I do think that some of that goes on. I think the idea that you can lower tax rates and see a bunch of wonderful things happen in terms of growth has been shown to be false many times over. This idea of supply side, this notion of supply side trickle down has a ton of empirical evidence against it. There are a couple of graphs that have actually changed some of my. I used to pay less attention to the impact on the tax structure on inequality because so much of the increase in inequality has been a pre-tax phenomenon. But there are a couple of graphs that I mentioned Tomas Piketty a minute ago. Well, Emmanuel Saez and Piketty have, I think I'm pronouncing the names correctly, have done tons of work on these issues. And they have some graphics that are quite telling. They show that countries that have cut their top marginal tax rate the most, and this is income, so it's not a direct answer to your question, but I'll get to the capital thing in a minute. Countries that have cut the top rate on income tax the most are countries that have had the highest increase in pre-tax inequality. Then the second graph after that looks at the relationship between those chopping down those top marginal tax rates for the wealthiest people and growth per capita, and shows no relationship, just a scatter plot. So that graphic does two things. It disproves trickle down because if you look at at least at that very simple level, if you look at scatter plot between countries that have cut the most at the top in growth, there's no relationship, and it shows a very pretty compelling correlation between chopping your marginal tax rates down at the top and an increase in your pre-tax inequality. So I do think that the tax code matters and that regressive changes in the code, of which favoring capital incomes or non-labor incomes is part of what we've done, is implicated in the increase in inequality. I don't probably believe, I guess I'm what economists call a small responder. In economics, you've got large responders and small responders. Small responders tend to view elasticities, which is the rate at which one variable reacts to a change in another variable, as pretty low, generally speaking, and large responders view it pretty high. I don't think you can tweak tax rates and see big changes in employment growth or capital investment. I think that Keynes was basically right about that in a kind of accelerator models, which really have demand at the core.
Well, thank you very much. Would you kindly use the microphone?
Thank you very much. I wonder if you could just explain a little more your attitude about why inequality has gotten worse over the last 30 years. I mean, in the last 30 years, we've had presidents from Reagan to Obama and everything in between. We've had Congresses that are Republican, Democratic, whole variety of different fiscal policies. You mentioned the trade deficit as a factor, but if you look at China, their increase in the Gini coefficient has tracked pretty closely the increase in the US, and yet China is running a big surplus. So there must be other things going on, or the way everything comes together that leads to this situation in the US, which is different from, as you mentioned, the other advanced economies like Germany.
So I think first of all, inequality in China is more complicated than I think your Gini coefficient example makes it sound. Interestingly, I actually find the Gini coefficient to be a somewhat insufficient summary measure because the Gini coefficient is not particularly influenced by large concentrations at the top or large absence of concentrations at the bottom. It tends to be mostly moved by changes around the middle of the income scale. And if you look at the concentration of income among if you start to look at the kind of the evolution of the wealthy in China, you certainly will see inequality rising, but you'll also see a middle class beginning to surface. And I think this very much relates to China reinvesting their surplus domestically. If you listen to Chinese leaders rhetorically, they'll begin to say, and they don't talk about it the same way we do, they'll begin to say, we have been disinvested. I'm not a China expert, and if there are China experts in the room, they may jump all over me for this, but my interpretation of what I've heard is that Chinese policymakers are beginning to awaken to the reality that they need to invest more domestically, that the mercantilist export-driven, surplus-driven model has actually hurt them in ways that are very consistent with my model. And as their trade surplus comes down, I believe it will help to boost domestic consumption, almost by definition, as they internally invest more, and that will help grow the middle class. Now, your other question, the broader part of your question, though, is very, very strong and very on point. We've had, I've accused bad policy as playing a role here, but you're correctly saying, well, okay, but we've had a lot of different policy throughout these last 30 years. Some of it, some of it lots of it by politicians of all kinds of different stripes. Is it really all bad? Well, it's not really all bad, but it's really all failed to attack the problem. I mean, the one thing you didn't cite in your litany there is the fact that the economy has been at non-full employment. So the unemployment rate has been above the full employment rate for 70% of the quarters between 1979 and now. And so I would argue that every regime has been errant in that regard. There would be, I would give the Clintonistas a bit of a break on that, because I actually think that some of their fiscal policy was more in the spirit of what I argued, and I would also argue that monetary policy in those years was more in the spirit of what I argued. And what happened in those years? We achieved the only full employment period of this last 30 years. So, in fact, when we got the policy right, things fell into place. Now, that's an N of 1. So your question is still well taken. But I can point to that period and say, here's a period where we invested in low-income people, we raised the minimum wage, yes, we lowered the budget deficit, but we really stopped worrying about that in the mid-90s, and it was growth that led us to surplus. And I can prove that. It was growth that led it to surplus, not fiscal changes. And the monetary authorities stopped believing that the Nehru was 6% and allowed the unemployment rate to fall much further. So I think I have one case where I can make my argument.
This question's a little unfair for an economist, but I'm going home for Passover in a few weeks, and I have an Uncle Ted who wants to know what the heck is going on in DC and how can we fix it. And instead of printing out Jared Bernstein's latest report from CAP and trying to, go through all the stats with him, do you have a sort of very simple story that the rest of us who, go home for Easter or Thanksgiving can talk with our family and friends about and sort of explain what's going on?
I mean, it is unfair because economists don't necessarily tell simple stories. But it's a great question. By the way, it's funny you should put it that way because I have a blog, jaredbernsteinblog.com, and I have many installments which you might enjoy, and others might enjoy as well, many installments called Pesky Brother-in-Law. I post them typically before holidays, and they're Q&A. And you go home and someone says, we're becoming Greece, these guys are crazy, and what's your answer to that? So you should look up my blog and read my Pesky Brother-in-Law posts. So I think the best way to deal with Uncle Ted is something that I was trying to get at before when I said, look around at the things that are really troubling you, Uncle Ted. What is it that bugs you? And Uncle Ted might say, I mean, you could chime in if I'm not claiming to know Uncle Ted, but I know a lot of Uncle Teds. Uncle Ted might say, the budget deficit. It's terrible. It's too high. So that's just factually wrong. And so one should know the facts and say, well, actually, in fact, the budget deficit was 10% of GDP. Now it's 3%. So that's not really a problem right now. Okay, well then if it's not the budget deficit, the economy stinks. Okay. the infrastructure, you may not say infrastructure, but the roads are falling apart. I went to the airport the other day and the planes were delayed because there was a freakish storm or the runway was broken. The schools stink. I'm trying to think of the kind of things that, at root, what Uncle Ted is complaining about is precisely the things that government is supposed to do, is precisely the things we need government to do. Private industry is actually doing, for the most part, what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to pursue profits, and let me tell you, it's doing it pretty well. I'm not saying every small business on the corner is doing great. They're not. But I'm less worried about that. What I'm worried about is government providing the public goods that, at the root of it, are probably at least part of what's bugging the heck out of Uncle Ted. The fact that the school system is maybe inadequate, the physical structures of the schools, the roads and the bridges, the basic kind of unfairness that the Occupy Wall Street group identified, the lack of accountability of the financial sector, tanks the economy but gets a bailout. These are the kind of things that really, I think, bug a lot of people. And what they all have at their core is a government that's not doing what it's supposed to do. So I think the message for the Uncle Teds, and I think it's a pretty simple message, is to break it down as to what it is that you don't like, what it is that's bothering you. You'll probably find out that government is failing to play its role in investing in the public sector. That's not a complicated concept. Investing in the public sector. Businesses won't invest in schools, public schools, because they're public. Businesses won't invest in roads because they're public. Businesses won't invest in the climate because they can't capture any profitability there. There is a role for government, Uncle Ted, and as long as you and every other knucklehead is sending people to Washington who doesn't understand that role, disparages that role, you'll continue to be very unhappy.
I'm going to chime in here, aside from suggesting that you don't call him knucklehead, and that you suggested if he finds the Fickerman, you trade him for a book of Dr. Bernstein called Crunch, and that may also help. But in all seriousness, I would say, Uncle Ted, I know you want to agree with that, but I need to tell you honestly that unless we do what was mentioned earlier and do something about the way people's deep pockets can buy their way in Washington and in state capitals and in town halls, all the rest is not going to work. There's one magic key, which if you turn that, it won't solve all the other problems, but will make looking at them rationally and treating them and at least a possibility. And unless we do that, all the rest will be, then you may as well pray to higher interventions. One more last question.
So I actually have two questions for you. So the first one you kind of alluded to earlier about the financialization of the economy. And can you talk some more about that and how that may or may not have contributed to increasing inequality? And then my other question is, you're at a university, student loan debt has increased dramatically. Most media reports say that it now has surpassed credit card debt in the United States. And what impact do you see going forward, especially for my generation, graduating into a weak economy with high levels of education, but also high levels of debt, and what do you think that's going to do for us in the future, even as the economy recovers?
I could tie these two questions together and try to figure out a way to create a derivative that shorts student debt, but that's probably not where you're going. Starting with the second question, I've looked at the College Board doesn't just run the SATs, they have a very good research group. And if you look at their work, you will come away feeling somewhat differently about student debt. You won't feel great about it, but you might feel somewhat less terrible. The median amount of student debt, the typical student's debt, is not is not far outside of its historical range. Maybe, I don't remember the numbers, but 15 to 25,000, something like that. Now that's not nothing, don't get me wrong, but many students have for decades graduated with debts of those magnitudes and been okay. The problem is numerous. There's a few problems. One is that the distribution of student debt has a fat tail. That means that there are there are a lot of students who have very large debt. There are a relatively small number of students who have very large debt levels, and for them it's very problematic. But what's most worrisome is the extent to which students are incurring debt and not completing college. Because the way to make this thing work is to complete college, hopefully at a good school like this one, pretty expensive one I'll say, but a good school like this one, and come out with the earning capacity to service your debt. The problem that so many students are, is they're loading up on debt and they're not completing. And so therefore, I've encouraged people in the field of kind of education economics, forever we've focused on college access and not college completion. Well, we sort of focused on high school completion, and we've done a pretty good job on that, although there are large pockets of deficits there. High school completion, okay, great, done okay with that. College access, well, we've done okay with that. And then you think you wash your hands. No, you have to worry about college completion, because not only do we fail to supply our labor force with the skilled workers we need if kids don't complete college, but they end up with unsustainable debt burdens. So I don't think the story is dire for the median student, but I do think it's dire for the extreme student and for the non-completers. Financialization and the role that it's played. Well, over the period of, let's take the 2000s. The 2000s, the business cycle of the 2000s was a uniquely lousy business cycle. I mentioned that in the 1990s, I told the gentleman who asked a good question before, that in the 1990s, we really did achieve full employment and lots of good things happened. In the 2000s, growth was quite slow in historical terms. Employment growth was the slowest it's ever been on record in terms of a business cycle. Unemployment came down pretty good, but that had a lot to do with weak labor force participation. The trade deficit was large, inequality soared, and we had the financial sector played a much larger role in the economy than it ever had before. It's on a secular path. It's continuously grown as a share of GDP, but it grew quickly and became not only large as a share of the economy relative to its past shares in the 2000s, but it very much reinforced this shampoo economy problem, which is bubble, bust, repeat, where you have a financial sector that innovates in ways that are underregulated, leading to the underpricing of risk, such that the underwriting of a mortgage in Cleveland becomes a systemic economic problem. The deregulation of the financial sector led to a mispricing of one of the most critical variables in an economy, which is risk. Risk has to be appropriately priced, otherwise too many people will become too leveraged. And we had a financial system that was incentivizing leverage. It led to a housing bubble that imploded to the tune of $8 trillion of wealth that evaporated. That led to the deepest recession since the Great Depression. So there's your financialization problem. A sector that grew, I think, quickly, a sector that grew, I guess I would say, too quickly relative to its contribution to actual productivity growth, relative to its contribution to the wages and incomes of lots of people, relative to its the role it played in underpricing risk relative to its role in a large bubble, relative to its role in helping to create the worst recession we've seen in 80 years. And I am happy to see financial reform in place to try to dampen this financialization problem as we go forward. But it has to be watched vigilantly, because this gets back to the very good question that was asked by the fellow there in the fourth row or so. Haven't we just seen bubble after bubble? And in fact, we have. So if we fail to learn the lessons that this excessive financialization and risk underpricing have taught us, we'll be right back there again. We passed Dodd-Frank financial reform, but the lobbyists are already trying to tear it apart. That's another reason why I'm glad to see Chairwoman Janet Yellen looks like she's taking this very seriously. If we don't take these issues of financialization, risk underpricing, systemic global risk seriously, we'll be right back here again eventually.
Well, as Dean Newcomer earlier told you, this is our first forum, and so we're particularly grateful to you for setting a very high standard for discussion we hope to have here. It will put a burden on others to follow, but today we are immensely beneficiary of a very thorough and academic treatment. We all know that you have another side. We have your blog and your witty and your popular side, but you left it at home and gave us today the full academic treatment, which was exactly right.
Good,
and very much appreciated. And thank you all for brilliant questions. And let's thank our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.